With COP shortly rounding off its long negotiations, we need to start looking forward to how we continue to push for a real phase-out of oil, gas and coal, and for a fast and also fair transition to clean energy and other low-carbon solutions beyond the summit itself. It's going to take firm commitments and international cooperation to ensure this happens, and that the momentum we gained in Dubai doesn't simply just die out. How do we do this, and how this will be the focus of this upcoming session with 4 amazing panelists. We have with us Rebecca Barnes, Deputy Director, Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And Rebecca leads on the initiative's legal strategy and previously advised least developed countries negotiations within the UNFCCC process. She has also worked in energy and just transition policy within government and at the London School of Economics. We also have with us Rajiv Joshi, lead author, Decisive Decade Inquiry. And Rajiv Joshi is an activist, economist, and social entrepreneur. He is lead author of the Decisive Decade Inquiry into the Future of Climate Action, a member of the Just Transition Commission, and also founder of Bridging Ventures. And also with us here in Dubai, coming up is Aisha Siddiqa, environmental and human rights defender. And she's a Times Woman of the Year 2023. She's a tribal Pakistani environmentalist and the co-founder of Polluters Out and Fossil Free University. And also joining us will be Annabella Rosenberg, Senior Advisor on Just Transition for Climate Action Network International. And Annabella is a global expert on the social justice dimension of environmental and climate policies. So back to Nick in Dubai to talk us through this with our guests.
Thanks very much indeed, Katerina, and we're very delighted. I think that Annabella has actually joined us already, so we don't have to wait for that magic moment. She's with us in the room. So let's start first by getting a kind of summary, maybe from each of you, on the biggest things that you think might have been achieved at this COP so far, and then we'll come to some of the elephants in the room. So Rebecca, let's go over to you first.
Thank you very much. So obviously the Loss and Damage Fund at the start of COP was a huge success. As someone who used to work with the Least Developed Countries group in the loss and damage negotiations, honestly, a couple of years ago, it would have been unbelievable that something like this would have happened in such a short time. So huge kudos to the negotiators and civil society who've been working on that. It's obviously not enough, but it's a really exciting start. For my organization, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, what's also been really exciting is that at this COP, we've had 4 new countries that have made a public call for a new international treaty on fossil fuels. So we came into the COP with 8 countries. We now have 12, including Nauru, who signed on just an hour ago. So incredibly exciting. And I think seeing that momentum for both within the negotiations, but also for a complementary initiative to the Paris Agreement from Nauru, Palau, Samoa, and Colombia here at the COP has been really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Great. Rajiv, any highlights for you that were interesting or positive?
I feel like this COP has put the phase out of fossil fuels into front and center of the negotiations, more so than any other COP. The pressure is irrefutable. I believe we will get some language in there about an equitable phase out of fossil fuels, and that we need to continue that pressure because it's the only way forward to save mankind, in the words of the Japanese, for example. The loss and damage was a massive development, I think. The proof will be in the pudding in terms of how that resource gets to the people who need it the most, and also how does it deal with the non-economic dimensions of loss and damage, which countries like Scotland have started to look at in terms of the extractive system. And then finally, I think on the adaptation agenda, maybe we aren't seeing enough progress. There's a lot of fear right now. The text is not yet out. And we need to remember that this COP still has 24 hours, if not more, to go. And this last leg of the race is going to be absolutely critical. And the litmus test for this COP really is, will we get that market signal of a phase out of emissions from this country that's been hosting this COP? And will we see the countries really come together in the way we need them to?
Aisha?
I'm going to echo my two colleagues earlier. I think the hopefulness that is out of this COP is the potential of having an equitable fossil fuel phase out in the mitigation work program in the global stocktake. And the kudos for me goes to the youth movement. We've been organizing on this for the past year. We've been working to get this language to negotiators, to civil society. We've been pushing out from stickers to campaigns to everything we can possibly do, and really approaching this in a strategic sense. So I'm incredibly proud of the youth climate justice movement.
Right. And Annabella, there's a kind of a similar ripple and echo stretching down the stage here, but from your perspective.
I think, I mean, of course, I absolutely agree on what has been flagged. I think like this COP, maybe for the first time, is letting the real world in. I mean, we are calling a spade a spade. I mean, we are discussing about the need for talking about fossil fuels as being a massive problem. We are also talking about justice. I mean, with the whole conversation about social justice and just transition and how we make this happen. We're also talking about what's happening in Palestine. And I think that is also part of the real world that is happening out there. This connection between human rights and climate justice. So somehow we are feeling the vibes and the mobilization of groups and movements outside, also in. I think that also what we are going to see right now is how much what the world takes as an evidence, which is that if we want to phase out fossil fuels, we need to address the deep challenges of what this means in a context of development, in a context of inequalities, in a context of unemployment. How do we connect the fossil fuel phase out with support, which for me is what's going to make us get into that just and equitable fossil fuel phase out that was mentioned before.
Right. Let me ask you a little bit, if we are to set the agenda for COP29, or which is the next big climate conference, of course, and is it Azerbaijan? Are we all convinced about that? It is Azerbaijan.
It's Baku.
Right, okay. And will it happen in Azerbaijan? Will it happen in Bonn? I don't know, but anyway. If we were to set the agenda for that conference, what would you like to see as the priorities in 1 year's time? Anybody?
If I may, and then maybe you can complement, the equitable fossil fuel phase out, which will come out of this COP, needs to be funded. It needs to be a funded fossil fuel phase out. The developing countries need assistance in phasing out, and the finance commitments need to level up. Earlier, my colleague mentioned that the Loss and Damage Fund commitments are being made. Around $400 million worth of commitments were made. We need $400 billion. It is just a drop in the ocean. And so the next COP must be a finance COP, and it must be putting the money where a country's mouth is.
Words matter, and the market signal that gets sent from this COP in terms of a fossil fuel phase out is absolutely critical, but actions matter that much more than words. And the fact that we have, if you look at the UNEP production gap report, a likelihood that most of the countries that are producing are going to double their production in terms of consistency of 1.5 pathways shows us that, you know, despite these words, the actions don't yet follow. So I'd love to see in Azerbaijan, where we'll again be in an oil producing country, a COP which really focuses on the actions that these oil producing states and companies are going to take to realistically phase out their production. And we need to do that in an equitable way, in a fair way, in a just way. And we need to finance that transition. We need a price on carbon that is meaningful, that allows us to get the resources that allow us to subsidize the renewables. We need the $1.7 trillion that's going into subsidizing the fossil fuel sector to start moving towards subsidizing renewables and also provide a level playing field for renewables. So financing the transition, and the Dutch taking that leadership, I think was another positive highlight of this COP. We need to see that coalition continuing to move from a first mover coalition to a coalition that continues to take more and more countries on board, so that we start to see the odds move directly in the favor of a renewable energy revolution.
Anybody else?
I would like to say that I think it's really important for us to start thinking, or keep thinking, about what do we want multilateralism for, and what do we want the UN Climate Convention to do. because I think like there are multiple expectations, and we could see, I mean, even before coming here, I mean, like a lot of people like wondering why we're still coming to UN summits, why is it important? And I hear you on the market signals. I think like this is also a space where negotiations are important, and reaching multilateral agreements is probably the only thing that separates us from killing each other and war outside. So I think like from my perspective, the next step here is also to start thinking very carefully, what is that we expect from the UN? In our case, we are expecting minimum standards. So it's not only first mover, but also what are the fundamentals of the climate regime we need? And also start thinking more deeply, where do we need progress elsewhere? Because until we change trade rules, until we change some of the intellectual property rules that are also blocking technology transfer, until we start talking about debt, and we know that that is being discussed in the international financial institutions, we are going to struggle to get this huge leap that we need in the climate regime. So I think like that connection also is needed. So of course we are going to keep mobilizing towards Azerbaijan or whatever the UN decides that we need to have a summit. I mean, this is not a conversation about whether we like or not a country, whether we like that government or not. That's out of the table. Climate Action Network, we are going to go wherever this process goes, because it's a legitimate expectation of any country to host this conversation. But of course, we are going to keep flagging the fact that the climate regime is not operating in a vacuum. It is operating in a bigger spectrum of rules that must be changed if we want to give climate the priority and justice the priority.
Maybe just to build on that point about multilateralism, I think we also have to be honest about what the UNFCCC can actually do. So the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement are incredibly important in setting the foundation for climate action, setting the baseline essentially. So they set the North Star of the 1.5 degree goal, and we hope coming out of this COP there will be a strong signal that countries must phase out of fossil fuels equitably. But the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement don't have a space within their provisions or agenda to negotiate the plan for that. So there does need to be complementary initiatives, linking to trade initiatives, as Annabella mentioned, but also a complementary initiative that helps countries understand and set targets for actually phasing out fossil fuels, and for wealthy fossil fuel countries to provide support to those countries that are incredibly dependent on fossil fuels for their lives and livelihoods, to be able to transition. And so, of course, that's why we're advocating for a fossil fuel treaty that would complement and sit alongside the Paris Agreement. So complementary initiatives that countries can come together and negotiate that use different rules of procedure that aren't consensus-based, but instead set a high bar of ambition. The most ambitious countries coming to the table through majority decision-making, deciding that they're going to create a set of carrots and sticks to incentivize countries to be involved and penalize those countries that aren't involved, to actually set that more ambitious and concrete plan for phasing out fossil fuels. And so we hope that parallel action will happen over the next year towards those kinds of mechanisms.
So I think you're absolutely right on this issue of finance and, the other processes out there, because I think when the United Nations was even set up in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was pretty much clear that the finance side was going to be given somewhere else, right? So it was given to the Bretton Woods institutions in Washington, and the UN has always got in trouble when it tries to get into economics. I remember working for the UN Environment Programme in the 2008 or 9 when we brought forward the green economy as an idea, and it was like, well, what's the UN doing in the economy sort of thing? So you're absolutely right. It needs to be absolutely amplified outside these halls. The decision is important here to send a signal elsewhere, but the signal has to be carried by the governments and probably other government departments into these other fora, and this is absolutely critical too, yeah. Did you want to say, I saw the microphone just bobbing up a bit close to you. Oh, it's okay, I thought I jumped in there. Let's also ask, Aisha, I want to come back on the youth movement again. What is the next phase of the youth movement on this?
Actually, we're taking a page out of the way that the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is organizing, the way that the young people from the Pacific are organizing, asking for the International Court of Justice to clarify on the obligations of human rights and climate change, and the mechanisms outside of the multilateral system. And so we are working on the first ever tribunal on the rights of future generations, a democratic mechanism to have young people, children, put forth their calls for what needs to be established today in order to protect the children born 100 years from now. And the thought behind that is, if we had a universal declaration on the rights of future generations written 100 years ago, we would not be in this mess. And this declaration must be from the ground up, as opposed to written by a handful of countries like when the UN was made. The multilateral system in its format and in the powers that it allows is in many ways the problem for which the climate change is not being solved. And so we want to not only democratize the rights of future generations, but as a movement, I think we are tired of asking everybody to recognize our future, to take it seriously. And so we will do what our elders failed to do, which is protect the rights of children yet to be born.
It's a very interesting point, this legislative route, right, and this litigation route and the creating of laws, because so often in the past we were all told, you know, well, with the Paris Agreement, it's soft law, so you can't really do anything in terms of, you know, but you see that, you've probably seen the reports that came out this year from the Grantham Institute in London, LSE, and is it Columbia University in the States, where you can see the litigation now taking off, right? People are bringing forward court cases against governments for not fulfilling their climate targets, against companies for basically lying about, you know, if you go on some airlines, they claim the air's cleaner after you've flown on that, right? And you know, there are cases against some of those airlines. So the legal route is no longer a redundant or a not really very effective route. It seems like it's gaining ground.
Yeah, and as a professor at Columbia University and also being at Oxford, where we've now been working on the future of climate cooperation, we've started to see a community of practice, including lawyers, but also regulators and policymakers come together around paving what we call the road to regulation, and recognizing that increasingly the voluntary approaches that we've been using are just not moving fast enough in this decisive decade. We've got to halve emissions by 2030. And we're nowhere near where we need to be. And the stocktake tells us that. But if we have the right rules and the right incentives, we need the stick as much as we need the carrot. Perhaps we can get there that much faster. Just like California with the clean air standards, for example, has really started to shift culture and shift behavior. And so I fully agree, we do need lawyers on board, and it's great to have people like Aisha who are using those tools in the toolbox.
Yes, and I think it's really important that we keep fighting the judiciary road and trying to get companies to comply even with minimum standards when it comes to climate action. And it also goes for states. I mean, like the French, People's Court case that has also, had lots of public support and has, basically used the Paris Agreement as a basis for, getting the French state condemned. I also think it's really important that we don't forget that climate action also has deep consequences and dimensions on people. So if we only get the judiciary road, or if we only get the regulatory road for emission reductions or caps, we are also leaving to the side the crucial need for anticipating the social and economic aspects of the transition that we need to build. And that's why we need leadership, and not only this sort of I would not say small, because they are incredibly important victories for the movement, but it's not sufficient to reassure people that are living on those industries that depend for their daily lives on some of them, including in hospitality sector, the health sector, public sector workers, that also basically their salaries get paid out of some of the royalties that the fossil fuel industry give to the state. What is our plan for them? What is our plan for the alternative development model that we need for countries? So getting them condemned for lack of action is part of the story. But we also need to be able as a movement to start building the alternative for them. And part of that is the renewable energy economy, but part of that is also thinking about what are the other sectors that are going to be bringing economic life to those communities, decent jobs for people. And I think there's also sometimes what I feel as a climate movement, we lack empathy for the ones that are actually there struggling to make ends meet and that also need to hear from us that we care and we are mindful of what this implies, and therefore pushing equally.
Yeah, because in the past, when a coal-fired power station was shut down, we all cheered, didn't we? But we didn't think about the people, who would lose their jobs, right? And so that was probably a bad play by all of us.
Yeah.
But I think it's changing quite rapidly, which is good news. At least the understanding that this is not acceptable to just put people out of work. Any other further thoughts on this, Rebecca?
I mean, I think my fellow panelists have covered it really well. I guess I would just say, maybe echoing some of the points that were made, litigation is an important part of the toolkit. It's incredibly expensive, incredibly lengthy, and often unsuccessful, but each successive case builds on the one before it. And we've seen this happen. We saw it happen with tobacco. We saw it happen with asbestos, where eventually there is a case that is sort of pivotal in changing, essentially is successful and can have an incredibly kind of flow-on effect impact. But we can't wait for that to happen. It needs to be happening in parallel to all of the things that we've heard about. But I think that it is still, the fact that that could happen at some point in the future also has a chilling effect. And that in itself is important. The risk of that potential successful litigation can also have a really important impact on country policies. And so it's important that it continues, but we can't rely on it. And we shouldn't be putting people in the situation where they need to litigate. We should be hopefully preventing climate impacts in the first place. So yeah, very much agree with everything that's been said.
Yeah, I wanted to add that there's litigation, and then there's mechanisms of pushing litigation. There's imagination. Litigation responds to imagination. And so for the youth movement, our responsibility is to reach so far into the heavens that if we land on planet Earth, it's still good. And so we are not employing litigation traditionally. We're trying to push even the bounds of litigation because of all of its restrictions and barriers. And I think in that manner, maybe if we land even like 20%, we'll be able to protect the future better than we have, and to build off of my colleagues' points.
Let's look at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty then going forward. So what are the political and the legal pathways to achieve a binding agreement, right? Because at the moment I'm not saying it's just a dream. It isn't just a dream. It's got, countries backing it now. It's got cities backing it. We had the mayor of Bonn from Germany on the show the other day. I think they were the first German city to sign up to the treaty, and there are many, many others. So, but it needs to be shaped a bit more, doesn't it? So if we get a good outcome here, or maybe even if we don't get a good outcome here, but we all decide there's a red line now that can't be passed, we need to build the structure of this treaty so it's ready to go, right? Sooner rather than later. What happens now with this treaty? How do you build it out?
Well, treaties are a country-driven process. So as you mentioned, we have 12 countries that are now calling for a treaty. There are a range of ways that they could take this forwards. Ideally, it won't be another consensus-based decision-making process, as I mentioned earlier. Ideally, the countries that are on board now, so 12 countries from 4 continents, including fossil fuel producers that have taken the brave step of recognizing that they need to transition, will work through their own diplomatic channels to broaden that group, to create a representative group of geographies, of economies, and of countries that have different levels of fossil fuel dependence. It's up to those countries to decide where they want to negotiate the treaty, but 2 likely routes are either through the UN General Assembly, or they could just decide to create a standalone process to negotiate a new treaty, which is what happened with the landmine ban treaty. And we know that those processes can happen quite quickly. So we're hopeful that within the next year or 2, we'll get to a point where there's a critical mass of countries that are willing to come to the table. And those countries are the countries that essentially get to write the rules of the new system together. So being involved earlier is an advantage, and decide where to negotiate and what it will look like. Again, the content is up to the countries, but I think a lot of what we've heard today about the importance of finance for the transition, thinking about those that are impacted by the transition alongside the phase out and ending expansion of fossil fuels are absolutely critical and will be key parts of that treaty.
Rajiv?
And I think one really critical piece about the treaty is that it's mobilizing our movement in ways that we haven't seen before for such a long time, since Paris in some ways. And a lot of what we're trying to accomplish here is about cultural change at a level that we've never seen, unprecedented change in culture. And so not only do we need a treaty itself, but we need millions of people to get behind this. And the fact that you've got 100 Nobel laureates, you've got states like California coming behind the treaty, you're starting to see a momentum build, which again speaks to this irrefutable pressure for change, that people somewhere within their spirit know that this current way of being isn't going to get us there, and we need to do something urgently to change the path that we're walking along. So hopefully this COP will deliver in some key ways, but that we will start to have complementary processes like the treaty, which will really take this to the next level, and allow those small island states and others to really speak truth to power at a time when so many livelihoods are at stake.
We've got literally about 1.5 minutes before I have to wrap up. So fire away.
So maybe, in this moment where we are just one day before the end of the COP, I think it's really important that we also salute all the efforts that have been done by the movements that have been asking for a fossil fuel phase out and a just and equitable fossil fuel phase out to be part of this conversation. I think the initiatives like the treaty are not only important because of the treaty, but I think they have also enabled the movement to focus on what is probably one of the biggest challenges we have right now, to have climate ambition at the table. And I think if we are today, right now, talking about this in this COP, in Dubai, in the Emirates, it's not because we've been given it as a favor. It has been the result and the outcome of a struggle. And trying to bring this conversation here. And I think today, I would say almost independent of what is going to happen tonight or in a couple of hours when we see the text, what is likely that we are going to be making a step forward that is even before of what we got in Glasgow. I think that it's extremely important that we keep ourselves in that focus, with that energy, because this is not going to deliver all the solutions. It's probably going to be a step forward, and then keep fighting on the next day as soon as we are back home.
If you get that language, it's no longer baby steps forward. It's a big step forward.
We have
right?
to leap. Yes.
So unfortunately, I've got to wrap it up here. But I just want to say, final conclusion: we've had the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as a theme throughout pretty much every day of our broadcasting here from COP28. And you're absolutely right. You're all absolutely right. The people that have been on have been absolutely fantastic, and I think they've not only educated the viewers out there, but really inspired this linkage between climate, environment, trade, human rights, the youth movement, and I feel there's a different texture to this conversation at COP28 than perhaps I've ever seen before, and I think that's really inspiring. We need inspiration too.